Today's Tanya for the 14th of Tammuz is in Nageres HaTshuva in Perek Daled. It's on page 186. The number at the bottom of the page is 356. The Alter Rebbe just finished asking the question that the punishment of Kodesh and Misa B'dei Shamayim used to be that it meant physical and literal death prematurely, either before 50 or before 60 years old. And yet we see today, and in the past generations, that people have committed those sins for which the punishment is either Kodesh or Misa B'dei Shamayim, and yet they live their life out in peace. So at the bottom now of page 186, the answer to this question. 4 lines from the bottom. Achalinyan hum yuvon al pi ma shekosuv ki chelek Hashem ameh. We'll understand this based on what is written, that the people, the Jewish people, are a chelek of Hashem, which means chelek mishem havaya baruch hu, that the Jews are a portion of the name Hashem. As he will say later, angels come from Elokim, from the name Elokim, and are sometimes referred to as Elokim, whereas the neshama of the Jew comes from Shem Hashem, Havaya, and therefore is called Chelek Hashem, that the Jew is a part of the name Hashem. Kedechsiv, as it says, Vayipach bi'apav nishmas chayim, man denofach meteche nofach, that the neshama was breathed into man, blown into man, and blowing means exhaling an internal breath. How do we describe God as exhaling when he doesn't have a physical form? But the Torah speaks in the language of men. By way of analogy, just as there is a great difference in the human being. For an example, what is the difference between the breath that is exhaled when one speaks compared to the breath that is exhaled when one blows? What is the difference? Because the breath that is exhaled in speech and speaking contains a very little bit of life. And that is because that breath comes from the external part of the nefesh, and therefore it contains a very minimal amount of life. But that which comes, the breath which is exhaled when one exhales forcefully, blows out forcefully, that is miteiche nofach, that comes from an inner part, melubesh bekeach v'chayis pnimi, it contains an inner life, a portion of the inner life, mebechinas hanefesh hachaya, in the inner life of the nefesh, not from the external part of the nefesh, but from the internal. So just as it is with man, that there's an external breath and an internal breath. The external breath contains little life. The internal breath contains significant life. The same is true also above, that in communicating and revealing himself, God reveals himself either as an external revelation or an internal revelation. So although we can't attribute to God any physical attributes or any physical form or shape, but we're using the idea of exhaling to show that there is a distinction between external and internal expression. And the same is true with God, although his expression is infinitely different from ours, but in his expression also there are these two kinds, the external and the internal. The same is true also by way of analogy above, even though hamavdul havdol is leinketz, even though we're talking about two very different things, but the concept applies to both. Because above also, there is a great distinction above, between the hosts of heaven, in other words, the higher creation, even the higher creations, Va'afilu hamalochim shenivru ma'ayin liyesh, and even the angels, which were created out of nothing. Chayim v'kayomim v'bechinas chitzenius achayus v'hashefa, and they exist and live off the external energy, shemashpia insev baruch hu, which God gives lahachayes ha'elameis, to give life to the worlds. Ubechina zu nikras b'shem ruach piv al derech moshul, and this external giving of life, or the giving of an external aspect of life, of godliness, this is referred to as the breath of his mouth. Kamesha Kosov, as we find written over Ruach Piv Kol Tzavaon, with the breath of his mouth, all their hosts. So we see that the hosts of heaven, including also the angels, are created by the breath of his mouth, which means the external part. The external breath is the one that is expressed in speech. And above, with God, it is the life that God gives that is expressed in the 10 utterances through which the world is created. The letters of the utterances are the vessels and the channels through which this external life flows to the world. So there's a great distinction between that level of creation, ubein nishmas ha'adam, and compared to the soul of man. In other words, the Jewish neshama. Shenim shechot chila mebechinas pnimis hachayis v'hashefa, because the neshama comes originally not from the external but from the internal life that God gives of himself, shemashpia insev baruch hu, kamesha kosu vayipach, etc. Here, when it comes to the neshama, it doesn't say the breath of his mouth, which is expressed in speech, but rather the breathing, vayipach, he blew into him a neshama. Because that's what comes from the internal life. And afterwards, after the initial expression of the neshama then comes down b'seisel hamadrega gamkein alidei bechinas ha'esiya sheb'maimer nasa adam. Then the neshama undergoes the descent also through the letters of speech, and in this case the utterance of "let us make man." So originally the neshama comes from an internal part of God, but in the process of its descent, it too travels through the level of external energy, of external life, which is the words with which the neshama is brought down to this world. And that is the statement, "let us make man." And this is kedei lehislabish beguf elam hazeh atachten, in order that the neshama, which is a part of God originally, should be able to be clothed in a body in this physical world. The neshama has to go through that external part of God, which brings it down to the level where it can be in the body. And that's why we find in the Torah that angels are referred to by the name Elokim. Ki Hashem Elikeichem Elikeihu Elikim. That God is the God of gods, which means the God of the angels. So we see that angels are called Elokim. It also says, Heidu Elikeihu Elikim, the God of gods, and again, a reference to angels. Vayaveyu b'nei ha'elikim lehisyatzev, that the angels came, and they're called again, b'nei ha'elikim. So why should angels be called Elikim? Lefi sheyenikas chayusam hime bechinas chitzenies, since their energy is derived from the external part of God's life-giving force, shehi bechinas ha'esies levad, which is the life that is contained in the letters alone, merely that and not more than that, v'shem Elikim, and therefore the name Elikim is appropriate, because hu bechinas chitzenies legabi shem havaya baruch, because of the names of God, Elikim represents the external, and Hashem represents the internal. Aval nishmas ha'adam, but the neshama, shehi mebechinas pnimis hachayis, which comes from an inner life, from an inner energy of God, he chelek shem havaya baruch hu, it is described as a part of Hashem, because as we said, Hashem represents the internal part of God. The name Hashem represents that part of God which is an inner aspect of life, and this is much, much higher than the level of letters or of speech. And therefore it is described as being blown into man. In the Hayom Yom, for the 14th day of Tammuz, the Rebbe writes that the Tzemach Tzedek notes in one of the Maimorim that on Tuesday of Parshas Bolok, in the year 1802, the Alter Rebbe said to his sons as follows: to understand the problem posed by the astronomers, that since the earth is round, spherical like an apple, why don't those people who live on the side of the globe opposite of ours, down below in America, why don't they fall off? So the answer that the astronomers give is not the true one. The Alter Rebbe then explained that the answer lies in the statement of the Eitz Chaim, the Kabbalah, that the 9 spheres, which seemingly is a reference to the planets, the 9 spheres derive their existence from a level, from a state called igulim, circles. And in a circle, there is no above or below. And for this reason, those who live opposite us, down below, have their heavens high above them, which arches in one continuous arch with the heavens which are above us, so that the earth there is below relative to the heavens that is over it, so that the people down below couldn't fall down away from the earth, because that would be falling up. Instead, they remain on earth because that is downward to them.